How to Train Your Dragon is probably one of the best franchises in DreamWorks history. Pretty much straight from the get-go, DreamWorks was a company that was built upon the franchise. They had a few misses early on, and then they struck gold with Shrek and they milked that franchise for all it was worth, and even chucked some spin-offs into the mix for good measure. They developed Madagascar and Kung Fu Panda and of course, How to Train Your Dragon. Generally, the trend for these franchises has always been to milk it as much as they can, until they don't have any more ideas for a story. They've always been rather good at ending things in that way. Shrek finished for a long time, and now it's only getting a soft reboot over a decade later. Madagascar's well and truly done and dusted. Kung Fu Panda usually takes very long gaps between installments, and How to Train Your Dragon ended in 2019 with the third film, The Hidden World. However, we just recently saw the release of the live-action adaptation of the first film in the trilogy, and it's gotten me back into a How to Train Your Dragon mood. On top of that, the movie's doing very well for itself by every metric studios would care about. It's getting a strong critical response and is making a lot of money, having grossed $371 million so far with a lot of time left on the clock. So of course it got me thinking about whether DreamWorks would ever actually consider bringing back How to Train Your Dragon for a fourth animated film, or is the franchise truly done and dusted? Could there be a How to Train Your Dragon 4, or is that a pipe dream that will never eventuate? Now I guess that's what I want to go through today. Would a fourth film make sense? Could the story work with how it ended with How to Train Your Dragon 3? I suppose from a business point of view it does make sense though. In fact, I'm honestly kind of surprised that they have never actually walked back on their decision to end the franchise yet. I think it's fairly clear that DreamWorks has always been somewhat of an outsider when it comes to box office success. It wasn't until their sixth film, Shrek, coming out in 2001, 7 years after the studio formed, that they really broke through and started seeing more success, grossing $492 million off of $60 million. A massive effort, and whilst they'd have their stumbles here and there, for the most part, they had a really great decade in the 2000s. Shrek 2 grossed close to $1 billion. Shark Tale grossed close to $400 million off a very low budget. Madagascar, over $500 million. Over the Hedge, close to $400 million. Shrek 3, $800 million. Kung Fu Panda, over $600 million. Madagascar 2, $600 million. It was just a different era, and combined with the fact that the budgets were so low, DreamWorks cemented themselves as a top-tier studio, and at times were legit in second place versus Pixar, whilst Walt Disney fell into a hole. The 2010s were probably a different story. Pixar kept getting bigger and bigger. Illumination entered the picture and started earning a lot of money and getting very popular due to Despicable Me. And then also the Disney Revival era kickstarted a fresh decade of critical and commercial success. In this era, DreamWorks struggled to compete. They'd milked Shrek and Madagascar for all it was worth, and whilst their finales were both big hits, their spin-offs, Puss in Boots and Penguins of Madagascar, they didn't have the same drawing power for audiences. They only managed a fraction of what the mainline series could do. Meanwhile, Minions always does well, showing that spin-offs can work and can be very lucrative. Just not for DreamWorks. Kung Fu Panda was still releasing and doing well across the decade and remains one of their bigger properties that can draw an audience to this day. Hence why the franchise is still going strong and why they're going to keep making those movies going forward. The rest of the decade though, not inspiring for the most part. They were trying to make new franchises and they did have some hits like the Croods, but for every Croods, there was 2 or more box office disappointments. However, across that decade, there was one franchise that really shone brighter than any and kept the studio afloat. How to Train Your Dragon. Released in 2010, the first film in the franchise grossed $494 million off of $165 million. It's a more modest gross than you'd probably expect for a franchise that would become that successful, but it was the early days and it would keep snowballing across the decade. The second film would go on to become the most successful film in the franchise so far, grossing $621 million off of $145 million. Then the third film, The Hidden World, grossed $540 million off of $129 million. Across the years, a very consistent money spinner. Not on the level of Shrek, but firmly in the realm of Kung Fu Panda. The fact that the live-action remake's currently sitting on $380 million after about 2 weeks, with plenty of time left to run, means that it's going to end up being very lucrative, which suggests that there's still a massive appetite for this franchise that's probably only grown in its absence. Then you can factor in that the 2020s have not been a good era for the studio. They fell off a cliff, and the big 3 well and truly pulled away. Whether the films are decent or not, the reality is that they can't crack those big numbers anymore. Croods 2, Spirit, Boss Baby 2, Ruby Gillman, Trolls 3, Dogman. None of these movies managed to crack $300 million. The only films that did were Puss in Boots 2, Wild Robot, and Kung Fu Panda 4. Of these 3, only Kung Fu Panda 4 and Puss in Boots had box offices reminiscent of the glory days of the studio, so it's not looking all that good. The majority of their films gross the same amount as films that other studios would consider to be massive flops. It's a very sad come down to the point that I'm pretty sure that they don't even animate in-house anymore. They outsource it. Ugh. So I guess that leaves me with the feeling that yes, The reality is that bringing back a big hitter franchise like How to Train Your Dragon is a sensible financial decision. We know that historically, even in a weaker era for the studio, that the franchise has held its own. We know that these days DreamWorks is often circling the drain, and that the new live action is doing very well, so it's just a no-brainer. It's why they're bringing back Shrek, it's why Kung Fu Panda is still going, it's why Pixar's decided to make a return to sequels now with the Inside Out 2 and the upcoming Toy Story film, plus Coco and The Incredibles in the pipeline. It's why Disney's doing the exact same thing with Frozen 3 and 4, as well as Moana 2 and Zootopia 2. It's why Illumination seemingly never wants to stop milking Despicable Me and the Minions forever and ever. They all know that this is where the money is. It's tried and tested. Whilst original content is often falling by the wayside and being ignored by audiences, losing a lot of money along the way. So yeah, story or no, it feels like common sense to bring it back. Studios love money. That's like their whole thing. And DreamWorks really needs it more than most. Those are just the financials. Reasons that have me somewhat confused as to why they haven't actually moved forward with any plans for the future of the franchise. However, in the end, those financial reasons really mean nothing at all in the face of this question. Is this something people would want? I honestly think that for many people, me included, the answer to this question is yes. For me, I just like the franchise and I want it to go on. Unlike a lot of people, I actually liked the Hidden World movie. And I think it's way too overhated. That being said, I have been massively critical in the past. Historically, I really thought the franchise bungled the ending so badly. On a rewatch, I personally have changed my point of view on this subject, but that doesn't mean everybody has. A lot of people still hate the movie to this day. And so now I'm going to look at things from their perspective and think about it from their point of view. Would they want it? I think the answer is yes, and here would be the reasons why. I think for a lot of people, the split between the dragons and the humans felt very forced, and honestly, didn't even make much sense. So there are only dragons in this very specific part of the world, despite multiple cultures the world over having their own legends about dragons? Toothless beating up some random dragon in the North Sea apparently makes him the alpha of all dragons, even dragging the whole world away? Plenty of other people could potentially be using dragons, and the Burkians would be screwed, right? Plus, the whole theme of the story always seemed to be hope. Hope and the belief that people can change. Yes, there are isolated instances of people who can't be reasoned with, like Drago Bloodfist, but for the most part, the film showcases that humans can learn and grow and be better. Except the third movie then says, well, actually, no, they can't. Only the Burke Vikings are good, and the rest of humanity are never going to change, and the dragons have to go away until such a time as they can live at peace with humans. Which is never, as the idea is that, oh, look, this is why there are no dragons in the real world. All of that build-up with Toothless and Hiccup, it's just over. It's a really depressing ending when the previous installments have been filled with hope and happiness. It wasn't even really bittersweet, it was just a bucket of cold water. That's the perspective. Now, do I agree with all of those points these days? No, I don't. But I do know that these are the big points of contention for the fans who dislike the Hidden World. So we've determined that it would make financial sense to continue on with the franchise given the lack of DreamWorks heavy hitters in the last couple of years. We've acknowledged that there is a fairly large subsection of fans that were not satisfied with the ending of How to Train Your Dragon in the Hidden World, and would like the franchise to depart on slightly better terms than it did. And then we also can acknowledge that from a creative standpoint, the wider movie-going audience, particularly when it comes to animated films, are looking for a hit of nostalgia to draw them to the cinema. The public is far more risk-averse than they've ever been due to the cost of living pressures, and the price of movie tickets just getting steeper and steeper. Since these animated films are marketed as family flicks, it means they want to be sure they're getting value for money. Even with all those factors in mind, though, it doesn't make a difference unless the story's there, unless the story's good. That is what matters the most. Is there a way to bring the franchise back in a way that makes sense, ideally without completely trivializing the ending of the third one? I think that there honestly has to be a way. Obviously, you need to take into account that the time skip would be taking place in this world. The end of the Hidden World is set 9 years after the main events of the film, and the children of Hiccup and the baby dragons are all rather young. One option is that you pick up the events of the story right there, which would make the children more side characters than anything else, because they're too young to be part of the main action of the story. Maybe they get kidnapped or something, I don't know. Honestly, if you did have the film take place in that era, then I think that maybe one of the Viking children, or maybe both, gets kidnapped and held hostage by randoms who know that only the Burkians, and specifically Hiccup and Astrid, know where the dragons are. Maybe those baby dragons snuck out to visit Burke again, and they get snatched too, and the old gang has to saddle up once more to lay down some justice on the would-be kidnappers. At the end, either they return to the status quo, or both Hiccup and Toothless realize that no matter what, there's going to be people that will hunt them forever, and so they need to face those threats together. That's one idea. Alternatively, if you want Hiccup's kids, and indeed Toothless's kids, to play a more active role in the story where they can properly fly and fight and whatnot, well, then perhaps you set it further in the future. Make them around Hiccup's age in the first or even the second film. Either would do. Then you have two options. Well, three, I guess. You could just do the exact thing I described earlier, which would be less interesting because there's less character agency for your new characters. Or you could do something like face an outside threat that forces dragons and humans to come back together. Maybe a monstrous dragon or a group of dragons that don't consider Toothless to be their alpha. Maybe they don't even have an alpha, because I'll be real, I always thought that having a magical alpha that can control you was a stupid plot point. It should always have been about actual violence, and the other dragons being kept in line by somebody who's really strong. It shouldn't have been hypnosis or mind control. That was goofy. Plus, we've already had two crazy dragon hunters back to back, so I guess it would be nice to actually showcase that some dragons are legitimately just monsters, like the Red Death. After all, they're supposed to be intelligent beings with complex emotions, and so, theoretically, they'd be capable of being evil, for instance. It would be something interesting to explore. Maybe you could go in the direction of Hiccup and Toothless and his family continuing to have meetups. Along the way, Hiccup's kids bond with Toothless's brood, and maybe one or both of them, when they're older, run away. Well, fly away, with the intention of exploring the wider world, with their parents in hot pursuit, and along the way they have to face deadly dangers. Bonus points if over time, Hiccup has become too stuck in his ways of isolation and keeping things as they were, accidentally mimicking his own parents who were both stuck in their ways as well. And these are just quick ideas I threw together in a couple of minutes. I'm sure actual paid professionals could think of something even better than that. So do it! Make How to Train Your Dragon 4. The time is now, strike while the iron is hot. But of course, these have been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the idea of How to Train Your Dragon 4? Do you want to see one? Maybe not? Do you have any ideas for what the plot could be? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.